If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share. Yeah!
A quiet fear. Have you ever smiled at someone, while secretly hoping they would not speak to you in English? That question followed me through my first months in the United States. Funny, right? You spend years studying English, watching slow English listening practice videos, memorizing phrases like "How are you?" and "Nice to meet you." But the moment a real American stands in front of you and asks something simple, your brain suddenly turns into a frozen potato. I still remember my first day arriving in California. Everything looked more cinematic than I expected. Bright airport lights, people pulling suitcases at high speed, voices everywhere, and English flying through the air like machine gun fire. I stood there with my old backpack, holding my phone with a translation app open like a desperate life hack. The funny part is that before moving to America, I thought my English was pretty decent. I could understand Netflix subtitles. I listened to beginner podcasts every night. I even practiced motivational speeches in front of my bathroom mirror like an unemployed TED Talk speaker. But America only needed 3 minutes to humble me completely. The man at the baggage counter asked me a question very quickly. I only caught the word today. So I nodded. He stared at me for 2 seconds and asked again. I nodded again like an office worker pretending to understand a meeting about quarterly sales reports. Then he sighed and pointed somewhere else. I grabbed my suitcase and walked away with my heart pounding like I had just escaped a bank robbery. That was the first moment I felt real fear. Not fear of America. Not fear of strangers. I was afraid of becoming small. Afraid of not being able to express myself. Afraid of starting over like a child learning how to speak for the first time. And the strangest thing? That fear slowly spread into every part of my life. Do you know the hardest part about living in a new country? It is not the cold weather. It is not the different food. It is the feeling that you are no longer fully yourself. Back home, you can joke naturally, speak quickly, and show your personality. But in a second language, you suddenly become the free trial version of yourself. Human brains are weirdly dramatic sometimes. Psychologists call this language anxiety. When you fear making mistakes, your brain activates stress responses, your heart beats faster, and your short-term memory works worse. In simple words, the more afraid you are of speaking wrong, the more your brain deletes every English word you have ever learned. Basically, your nervous system starts throwing a tiny tantrum in public. I slowly began avoiding conversations. At grocery stores, I always picked self-checkout machines so I would not have to speak to cashiers. I ordered food by pointing at menus like a secret agent exchanging classified information. One day, a girl inside a coffee shop smiled at me and asked, "How's your day going?" I froze for 3 full seconds like an old laptop trying to load too many tabs. Then I answered, "Yes." Even now, I still want to apologize to the entire English language for that moment. But something interesting started happening during all those awkward experiences. I began watching Americans more carefully. They smiled easily. They said sorry even when you accidentally bumped into them. They asked "How are you?" even when they would probably never see you again. At first, I thought it felt fake. But later I realized it was part of the culture here. Tiny moments of connection between strangers. One cold autumn evening, I sat outside my tiny apartment alone. The wind was freezing. Cars moved endlessly across the street. The city lights looked beautiful, but inside, I felt painfully lonely. I opened YouTube and listened to a slow English story for beginners. The narrator spoke very slowly and clearly. Don't be afraid to start small. That sentence hit me harder than expected. I realized I had spent months believing I needed perfect English before I deserved to speak. But children do not learn language that way. They make mistakes constantly. They pronounce words badly. They mix up sentences. Yet they keep talking anyway. And eventually, they communicate. That night, I decided to change one small thing. Just one. I would stop trying to sound perfect in English. I would simply try to sound honest. Slower. Simpler. More real. The next morning, I walked into a small coffee shop near the bus station. My heart was beating so fast it felt like my chest was buffering. The cashier smiled and asked, "What can I get for you?" Normally, panic would take over my brain like an emergency alarm. But this time, I took a deep breath and spoke slowly. "Hi. Can I have a small hot coffee?" That was it. No complicated grammar. No perfect accent. No pretending to sound smarter than I was. And do you know what happened? She smiled naturally and said, "Of course." Just two simple words. But somehow, they felt like someone unlocking a door I thought had been closed forever. Maybe you're carrying the same fear right now. Fear of speaking incorrectly. Fear of embarrassment. Fear that you are too late or too slow to improve. But sometimes life does not ask you to become fearless overnight. Sometimes it only asks you to open your mouth for the very first time. And at that moment, I had no idea that this tiny coffee shop, my broken little English sentence, and one ordinary smile were about to completely change my love story in America. Coffee shop smile. There is something dangerous about loneliness in America. At first, it feels quiet and manageable, like background music inside a grocery store. But after enough cold evenings and silent bus rides, loneliness slowly starts narrating your entire life. It tells you nobody notices you. Nobody cares whether you improve your English or not. Nobody remembers your face after conversations. And honestly, during my first year in United States, I almost believed it. My routine became painfully predictable. Wake up. Practice slow English listening while making cheap instant coffee. Go to work pretending I understood every fast conversation. Smile awkwardly. Return home exhausted from translating reality inside my head all day long. Then repeat everything tomorrow like a human-shaped software update nobody asked for. But one small coffee shop quietly interrupted that routine. It sat near the corner of a crowded street beside a laundromat and a tiny bookstore that always smelled like old paper and cinnamon. The coffee shop itself was not fancy. The chairs squeaked. The walls needed paint. The menu board looked like it had survived several emotional breakdowns. But somehow the place felt warm in a way expensive places never do. Every morning before work, I started going there for the same small hot coffee. Partly because the coffee was cheap. Mostly because the people there spoke slowly enough for my nervous system to survive. The woman behind the counter recognized me after about 2 weeks. She had curly brown hair, tired eyes, and the kind of smile that makes stressful days feel temporarily negotiable. Her name tag said Emily. The first few conversations between us were extremely short. Honestly, they sounded less like human interaction and more like two robots politely exchanging survival information. "Small coffee?" she asked. Yes. Anything else? No. Have a good day. You too. That was it. 5 seconds of dialogue. The entire relationship between my social anxiety and civilization. But something strange happened over time. My fear slowly became smaller. Not dramatically. Not like inspirational movie scenes where orchestral music suddenly plays and the main character becomes fluent overnight. Real confidence grows slower than that. It grows quietly, like plants inside a room you forgot to check for weeks. One rainy morning, the coffee shop was almost empty. Soft jazz music floated through the speakers. Outside, people rushed across the street holding umbrellas like shields against emotional damage. I walked to the counter, expecting the usual routine. But Emily looked at me and asked, "You always come here before work?" Simple question. Yet my brain immediately panicked like a smoke detector with low batteries. The old version of me would have nodded silently and escaped. But something inside me hesitated differently that day. Maybe it was the exhaustion from being afraid all the time. Maybe loneliness had finally become more painful than embarrassment. Or maybe my English listening practice videos were secretly working while I slept. Either way, I answered slowly. Yeah, every morning. Coffee helps me wake up. Emily laughed softly. Honestly, same. That tiny moment lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt weirdly important. Because for the first time since arriving in America, I was not just ordering something. I was participating in a conversation. Human brains are fascinating that way. Psychologists explain that positive social interactions release dopamine, the chemical connected to motivation and reward. Which means one kind smile can literally retrain your brain to feel safer speaking a second language. Basically, my nervous system was learning that English conversations would not automatically kill me. Revolutionary discovery, honestly. After that morning, our conversations slowly became longer. Not impressive conversations. Not deep philosophical discussions about life and destiny. Just small ordinary things. Weather. Work. Traffic. Coffee flavors. But those tiny conversations mattered because they felt real. Every sentence became practice. Every awkward pause became training. And the interesting thing about slow English conversations is that they teach you more than vocabulary. They teach rhythm, emotion, timing. They teach you how people actually connect. One afternoon, Emily asked where I was from. I told her. Then she smiled and said she had never traveled outside America before. That surprised me. Before moving to the United States, I imagined Americans traveling everywhere confidently while speaking perfect movie dialogue English. But Emily admitted she felt nervous even visiting other states alone. Fear suddenly looked more universal than I thought. Maybe everyone is afraid of something. Some people fear speaking English. Some people fear being alone. Some people fear love because it requires vulnerability. Fear just changes outfits depending on the person. A week later, something embarrassing happened that completely changed our dynamic. I walked into the coffee shop half asleep after barely surviving an exhausting work shift. Emily smiled and asked, "The usual?" My brain, still emotionally buffering, accidentally answered, "I love you." Time stopped. My soul left my body. Somewhere in the distance, I could probably hear dramatic violin music playing for my funeral. Emily blinked twice, then burst out laughing so hard she almost dropped a cup. My face instantly became hotter than the coffee machines behind her. I wanted to teleport into another dimension. I mean, coffee, I stuttered. I love coffee. She kept laughing. That's probably the best accidental confession I've heard all year. Here is the weird part though. Instead of destroying my confidence, that embarrassing moment actually helped me relax. Because once you survive saying I love you by accident to a barista, ordinary English mistakes stop feeling so terrifying. My anxiety had basically peaked emotionally. Everything afterward felt survivable. Neuroscientists often explain that exposure reduces fear. The more you experience embarrassing situations without catastrophic consequences, the weaker your fear response becomes over time. In simple words, your brain slowly realizes the world will not explode because of one awkward sentence. Looking back now, I think that coffee shop saved me in ways I did not understand at the time. Not because of romance. Not yet. But because it gave me something loneliness had taken away, connection. Real connection. Tiny human moments repeated consistently enough to soften fear. And maybe that is why slow English learning works best through stories instead of textbooks. Stories create emotional memory. You remember feelings longer than grammar rules. You remember the smile behind the sentence. The nervous heartbeat behind the pronunciation. The warmth behind the mistake. One evening before closing time, I stayed longer than usual while rain hammered against the windows outside. Emily wiped tables while soft music played overhead. Then she looked at me casually and asked, "Do you ever miss home?" Such a simple question. But something about the way she asked it felt different. Gentler. Realer. And for the first time since arriving in America, I answered honestly. Every day. Emily became quiet for a moment. Then she smiled softly and said, "That sounds lonely." I laughed nervously and looked down at my coffee cup. "Yeah, sometimes." She nodded slowly like she understood something deeper than my words. Then she said something I would replay in my mind for months afterward. "You know, you don't look as scared as when you first came here." That sentence hit harder than she probably realized. Because maybe courage does not arrive dramatically. Maybe courage looks like returning to the same coffee shop long enough for someone to notice you are changing. And what I still did not know was that Emily was about to become much more than the girl who served my morning coffee. She was about to become the reason I finally stopped running away from fear altogether. Winter felt lonely. Nobody warns you that winter in United States can feel personal. Not just cold. Personal. The kind of cold that sneaks into your apartment through tiny window cracks and somehow reaches your thoughts too. During my first winter in America, the sunsets came early, the streets became quieter, and loneliness suddenly grew louder than traffic. Back home, winter had always meant family dinners, noisy kitchens, warm conversations. And somebody asking if you wanted more food every 15 minutes like a competitive sport. But in America, winter often looked like strangers wearing headphones while walking quickly past each other under gray skies. Everyone seemed busy. Everyone seemed emotionally booked in advance. And honestly, there were nights when I wondered if moving here had been the biggest mistake of my life. My apartment looked exactly like the type of place you imagine when someone says temporary struggle. One small bed. One tiny kitchen. One heater that made noises like it was fighting for survival. Sometimes I sat on the floor eating microwaved noodles while listening to slow English stories for beginners on YouTube because silence felt heavier than background voices. The strange thing about learning English through stories is that you slowly become emotionally attached to the narrator. Their calm voice starts feeling like company. Their pauses feel comforting. Their simple sentences make your exhausted brain relax. Neuroscientists actually explain this phenomenon. Human brains respond positively to familiar voices and predictable speech patterns because they reduce cognitive stress. In simple words, slow English listening can calm anxiety because your brain stops fighting to survive every sentence. Honestly, my English practice videos were becoming cheaper than therapy and somehow almost as effective. Around that time, Emily became the brightest part of my routine. Every morning before work, I stopped by the coffee shop just to see her smile for 30 seconds like an emotionally confused customer with attachment issues. Our conversations slowly became easier. My English still sounded clumsy sometimes, but now I worried less about mistakes. And something unexpected started happening. Emily listened carefully when I spoke. She did not interrupt when I searched for words. She waited patiently through awkward pauses. That sounds small, but if you have ever struggled with a second language, you know how rare that kindness feels. Most conversations move too fast. People finish your sentences. Your brain runs a marathon while everyone else casually jogs. But Emily somehow made English feel slower. Safer. One snowy evening after work, I walked into the coffee shop completely exhausted. My jacket was wet from freezing rain. My fingers felt numb. Outside, the streets looked blurry beneath white streetlights and moving headlights. The cafe was almost empty except for an older man reading a newspaper and someone typing furiously on a laptop like they were trying to save the economy before midnight. Emily looked up when I entered and immediately laughed softly. "You look like winter personally attacked you." I smiled tiredly. Winter is winning. She handed me a hot coffee before I even ordered. "This one's on me," she said casually. And listen, I know it was only coffee. But when you feel alone in a foreign country, tiny acts of kindness become emotionally dangerous. Suddenly your heart starts acting like a dramatic screenwriter. We sat near the window while snow drifted quietly outside. For the first time, our conversation moved beyond weather and work schedules. Emily asked about my family. I told her about my mother calling me every weekend asking if I was eating enough vegetables like nutrition could solve homesickness. Emily laughed so hard she nearly spilled coffee on the table. Then she told me about her own family. Her parents divorced when she was young. Her father lived in another state. Her mother worked long hours. Holidays felt complicated sometimes. That surprised me because I had secretly imagined American families looking perfect like television commercials where everyone smiles while eating giant Thanksgiving dinners. But real life rarely looks like advertisements. Real life is messier. More human. Psychologists often explain that vulnerability creates emotional closeness faster than perfection does. When people share loneliness, fear, or painful memories, the brain releases oxytocin, the chemical connected to trust and bonding. Basically, emotional honesty is social glue. And that night, something invisible shifted between us. The conversation became softer, slower, more real. At one point, Emily looked outside at the falling snow and asked quietly, "Do you ever feel like you don't fully belong here yet?" That question hit me so hard I almost forgot English entirely for a second. Because yes. Constantly. Every day. Sometimes belonging in America felt like trying to join a conversation that already started years before you arrived. The jokes moved too fast. The cultural references flew over your head. Even small things felt confusing. Tipping culture. Small talk. Smiling at strangers. Saying how are you? Without expecting an honest answer. My brain treated daily life like a full-time decoding mission. I looked at Emily and answered honestly. Yeah. Sometimes I feel invisible. She became quiet for a moment before saying something that stayed inside my mind for months afterward. I think a lot of people here feel invisible too. They're just better at hiding it. That sentence changed the way I saw America. Before that moment, I imagined loneliness belonged mostly to immigrants, international students, or people learning English. But Emily made me realize loneliness is everywhere. Some people hide it behind busy schedules. Some hide it behind humor. Some hide it behind confidence. Human beings are strangely talented at smiling while emotionally buffering in the background. After that night, I started noticing things differently. The tired cashier at the grocery store. The old man eating dinner alone at a diner. The woman crying quietly inside her parked car before going into work. America suddenly felt less like a country filled with confident strangers and more like millions of people trying to survive emotionally complicated lives. And weirdly enough, that realization made me feel less alone. A few days later, Emily invited me to walk through a small Christmas market downtown after her shift ended. My first instinct was panic. Social situations outside the safety of the coffee shop felt terrifying. My brain immediately started generating worst-case scenarios like a low-budget disaster movie. What if I could not understand her? What if conversations became awkward? What if I embarrassed myself again? Anxiety loves creating fictional documentaries about your future failures. But something inside me said yes anyway. That night, the city looked beautiful. Christmas lights reflected across wet sidewalks. People carried shopping bags and warm drinks while music floated through the cold air. Emily walked beside me wearing a thick scarf and talking about random childhood memories. And for the first time in months, I stopped mentally translating every sentence before responding. I just listened. I just spoke. Slowly. Naturally. At one point, we stood beside a small booth selling hot chocolate. Emily looked at me carefully and smiled. You laugh more now. Such a simple observation. Yet hearing those words felt strangely emotional because I realized she was right. Somewhere between nervous coffee orders and awkward winter conversations, fear had loosened its grip on me a little. Not completely. Fear rarely disappears that easily. But it was changing shape. Becoming smaller. Becoming survivable. What I still did not realize was that this lonely winter, these slow conversations, and this growing connection with Emily were quietly leading both of us towards something neither of us was prepared for. Because sometimes the scariest part of moving to a new country is not learning a new language. It is discovering that your heart can start feeling at home before your mind does. Learning through mistakes. Have you ever said something so embarrassing in English that your soul temporarily left your body? Because during my second winter in United States, embarrassing mistakes basically became my unofficial personality. The funny thing is that when people watch slow English listening practice videos online, they often imagine language learning as calm and inspiring. Soft music. Clear pronunciation. Peaceful progress. But real-life English learning sometimes feels more like your brain slipping on a banana peel in public while everyone watches politely. And strangely enough, those humiliating little moments ended up changing my life more than grammar books ever did. By then, Emily and I had become close enough to spend time together outside the coffee shop regularly. We explored bookstores, cheap diners, Christmas markets, and quiet neighborhoods filled with tiny houses decorated with lights that looked aggressively cheerful. America during winter had a strange energy. Everything looked beautiful and lonely at the same time. But no matter how comfortable I became around Emily, one problem remained constant. My English still betrayed me in spectacular ways. One evening, we were walking downtown after dinner when Emily asked if I wanted to hang out again the next weekend. Now, if you learned English mostly through textbooks, phrases like hang out can become dangerous. My exhausted brain somehow translated it into something related to physical hanging. So I stared at her with genuine concern and asked, why would we hang outside? Emily stopped walking. For 3 seconds she looked confused. Then she laughed so hard she had to lean against a wall. Meanwhile, I stood there emotionally buffering like outdated software. No, she said between laughs. Hang out means spending time together. I nodded slowly like a man discovering civilization for the first time. Here is the interesting thing about mistakes though. Neuroscientists explain that embarrassment actually strengthens memory formation because emotional reactions increase activity in the amygdala, the brain region connected to emotional learning. In simple words, your brain remembers emotionally painful moments better than emotionally neutral ones. Which explains why I still remember every humiliating English mistake from the past 2 years with cinematic clarity. My suffering was apparently excellent educational material. Emily became fascinated by the strange English phrases that confused me. Honestly, American English sounds completely unhinged sometimes. Why do people say piece of cake when nothing edible is happening? Why does break a leg mean good luck instead of immediate hospitalization? Why does I'm down sometimes mean sadness and sometimes mean excitement? Learning conversational English felt less like studying a language and more like surviving a prank designed by emotionally unstable poets. One afternoon at the coffee shop, Emily asked me to help carry supplies into storage. Trying to sound confident and useful, I proudly told her, "Don't worry. I am very hardly working." Emily froze for half a second before laughing into her sleeve. I immediately realized something had gone terribly wrong. Apparently hardly working means barely working at all. So instead of sounding responsible, I accidentally announced myself as a professional slacker. Honestly, English should come with warning labels. But something important started happening during these awkward moments. Instead of feeling crushed by embarrassment, I slowly learned to laugh too. That changed everything. Psychologists often explain that self-directed humor reduces social anxiety because laughter interrupts the brain's threat response. Basically, when you laugh at your mistakes instead of treating them like disasters, your nervous system relaxes. Your brain stops acting like every conversation is a hostage negotiation. Emily once told me something I never forgot. You know what's weird? She said while cleaning coffee cups one quiet evening. When you first came here, you were always trying to sound perfect. But now you sound more real. That sentence stayed with me because she was right. At the beginning, I treated English like a performance. Every sentence felt like an exam. I wanted perfect grammar, perfect pronunciation, perfect timing. But perfection creates tension. And tension suffocates communication. The more relaxed I became, the more natural my English sounded. Not flawless. Just human. Around that time, Emily convinced me to join her at a small game night hosted by some of her friends. The idea terrified me immediately. One-on-one conversations already drained my mental energy. But a group conversation in fast American English? That sounded less like social interaction and more like psychological warfare. My brain prepared for disaster all week. Humans are amazing at imagining catastrophic futures. Your mind can turn one casual social invitation into a full emotional apocalypse before breakfast. Still, I agreed to go because part of me was tired of hiding from life. The game night took place inside a cozy apartment filled with loud laughter, pizza boxes, and people speaking at terrifying speed. At first, I barely understood anything. Conversations bounced around the room like tennis balls fired from cannons. My brain tried desperately to keep up while also translating slang, jokes, and cultural references in real time. Honestly, I felt like a confused tourist trapped inside a podcast. But then something unexpected happened. One of Emily's friends accidentally knocked over a drink, and suddenly everyone started telling stories about embarrassing moments from work, school, and relationships. The atmosphere changed instantly. People stopped trying to sound impressive. They became messy, funny, honest. One guy admitted he once called his teacher mom in college. Another woman described accidentally sending a romantic text message to her dentist instead of her boyfriend. Human beings become much less intimidating once you realize everyone is secretly chaotic. At some point, Emily looked at me and asked, "What about you? Funniest English mistake?" Every eye in the room turned toward me. Old fear immediately returned. My heartbeat sped up. For a second, I considered pretending sudden illness and escaping through the window dramatically. But instead, I told them the coffee shop story. The accidental "I love you." Silence lasted maybe 1 second before the entire room exploded with laughter. Not cruel laughter. Warm laughter. Connected laughter. And while everyone laughed, something shifted inside me again. I realized communication is not about speaking perfectly. It is about creating emotional connection. People rarely remember perfect grammar. They remember honesty, timing, vulnerability, emotion. That realization changed the way I practiced English forever. I stopped memorizing complicated textbook phrases that nobody actually used. Instead, I focused on listening carefully, speaking slowly, telling stories naturally. Neuroscience research actually supports this approach. Studies show emotional engagement dramatically improves language retention because meaningful communication activates multiple memory systems simultaneously. In simpler words, your brain learns language faster when feelings are attached to it. That explains why I forgot hundreds of grammar exercises but never forgot conversations connected to fear, laughter, loneliness, or affection. Late that night after the game ended, Emily and I walked outside beneath freezing air and glowing streetlights. The city felt quieter now. Snow-covered parked cars in soft white layers. Emily looked at me and smiled differently than before. Softer somehow. More thoughtful. You were really funny tonight, she said. I laughed nervously. I was mostly confused tonight. Yeah, she replied quietly. But you stayed anyway. Strange how one simple sentence can reveal more than compliments ever do. Because she was right. The old version of me would have escaped uncomfortable situations immediately. But now I was staying. Speaking. Trying. Failing publicly and surviving. Maybe courage is not becoming fearless. Maybe courage is just deciding embarrassment will no longer control your life. And as we walked together through the freezing American night, I had no idea that my growing confidence, my ridiculous English mistakes, and Emily's patient smile were slowly turning into something far more dangerous than friendship. A small road trip. There is a dangerous moment in every growing relationship when things stop feeling casual. It does not happen dramatically. No movie soundtrack suddenly plays. No giant emotional speech appears from the sky. Instead, it sneaks into ordinary moments. A longer eye contact. A conversation that lasts past midnight. A message you reread 3 times before sleeping. And during my second spring in United States, Emily accidentally pushed us straight into that dangerous territory with one simple question. Do you want to take a short road trip this weekend? Now listen carefully. If you are learning English, road trips in American culture are practically emotional laboratories on wheels. Movies romanticize them constantly. Friends become closer during them. Couples fall in love during them. Families argue during them. Somewhere between gas stations and terrible playlists, people start revealing who they really are. So naturally, my brain reacted to Emily's invitation with immediate panic. Spending hours together inside a moving car sounded intimate in a way coffee shop conversations never were. There would be no easy escape. No pretending to check my phone every 5 minutes. Just endless conversation, awkward silences, and my still imperfect English trying desperately not to embarrass me. But another part of me felt strangely excited too. Because fear and excitement often wear the exact same outfit inside the human body. Your heart beats faster. Your stomach tightens. Your brain becomes loud. Neuroscientists actually explain that the physical symptoms of fear and attraction overlap heavily. I said yes before my anxiety could organize a formal protest. Saturday morning arrived cold and cloudy. Emily picked me up in an old silver car that looked like it had survived several emotional breakdowns and at least one parking accident. Coffee cups rattled inside the cup holders. Soft indie music played quietly through the speakers. And somehow, seeing her smile through the driver's window made my nervousness calm down a little. Ready? She asked. Probably not, I answered honestly. She laughed. Good. That makes 2 of us. We drove north along the California coast while fog rolled across the ocean like slow-moving smoke. Palm trees blurred past the windows. Tiny beach towns appeared and disappeared beside the highway. Everything looked cinematic in the kind of quiet way that makes you suddenly understand why people write songs about road trips. At first, our conversation stayed light. Music. Food. Funny customer stories from the coffee shop. But road trips do something strange to people. The longer you drive together, the more conversations slowly drift deeper without permission. Maybe it is the rhythm of the road. Maybe it is the feeling of temporary escape from normal life. Or maybe humans simply become more honest when staring out car windows dramatically. At one point, Emily asked what surprised me most about America. Honestly, I had too many answers. The size of grocery stores. The obsession with ice in drinks. The way strangers casually discussed weather like it was a national emergency. But after thinking quietly for a moment, I answered differently. People here seem independent very early. Emily glanced at me curiously. What do you mean? Back home, I explained slowly, families stay emotionally close for a long time. Parents worry about everything. Sometimes too much. But here, people move out young. They live alone. They figure things out alone. Emily smiled faintly like she understood exactly what I meant. Yeah, she said softly. Sometimes too alone. That sentence stayed in the car between us for a few seconds. Because beneath America's confidence and freedom, I had started noticing another reality too. Many people here carried loneliness very quietly. Individual freedom looked beautiful from the outside, but it also came with emotional distance sometimes. People respected personal space so much that they occasionally built invisible walls around themselves without realizing it. We stopped at a small diner near the ocean around lunchtime. Inside, the place smelled like coffee, pancakes, and decades of human exhaustion. An older waitress called everyone honey regardless of age, gender, or emotional stability. Honestly, American diners feel less like restaurants and more like places where tired souls temporarily recharge. Emily ordered pancakes. I ordered eggs and toast while silently praying my pronunciation would not betray me in public again. While waiting for food, Emily suddenly asked something unexpected. Were you scared to move here? That question felt bigger than the sound of it. Because yes. Terrified. But fear is complicated when mixed with ambition. Sometimes you leave home not because you are brave, but because staying feels even scarier. I stared down at my coffee cup before answering carefully. I thought America would change my life immediately. Like magic. Emily smiled knowingly. And? I laughed quietly. Turns out life is still life. Just in English. She laughed so hard the waitress looked over at us suspiciously. But beneath the joke, something important existed. Moving to another country does not magically erase insecurity, loneliness, or fear. Your emotional baggage arrives with you. Sometimes literally overweight at the airport. But slowly, through conversations and experiences and tiny daily victories, you start rebuilding yourself differently. After lunch, we drove toward a quiet beach surrounded by cliffs and cold wind. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath gray skies while waves crashed violently against rocks below. Emily pulled her jacket tighter around herself as we walked slowly along the shore. I come here when life feels loud, she admitted quietly. I looked around at the empty beach, the crashing waves, the distant seagulls floating above the water. It feels peaceful. Exactly, she said. The ocean reminds me that my problems are small. Human brains love perspective. Psychologists explain that awe-inspiring environments like oceans, mountains, and forests reduce mental stress because they interrupt obsessive self-focused thinking. In simpler words, nature humbles your anxiety temporarily. And standing beside that enormous ocean, I suddenly realized how much my life had changed already. Months earlier, I could barely survive ordering coffee in English. Now I was walking beside someone I deeply cared about, sharing real conversations about fear, loneliness, and identity. Slowly. Imperfectly. But genuinely. At one point, Emily stopped walking and looked at me carefully. "Can I tell you something weird?" she asked. "Sure." She hesitated before smiling nervously. "When we first met, I thought you didn't like me." I stared at her in shock. "What? Why?" "Because you barely talked," she said, laughing softly. "You always looked nervous. I thought maybe I was annoying you." I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity of it. All this time, I believed my silence protected me from embarrassment. But from her perspective, my fear looked like disinterest. That realization hit hard because it explained something important about communication. People cannot read your intentions. They only experience your behavior. Sometimes fear disguises itself so well that even kindness becomes invisible behind it. The wind grew colder as sunset painted soft orange light across the ocean. Emily tucked loose hair behind her ear and looked out toward the horizon quietly. Then she asked the question that changed the emotional direction of everything between us. "What are you really afraid of?" Simple sentence. Devastating timing. My chest tightened immediately because I knew she was not talking about English anymore. And standing there beside the freezing Pacific Ocean, with waves crashing violently below us and sunset fading behind gray clouds, I realized I had spent months learning how to speak English, while still hiding the truth about my heart. The argument at midnight. There is a moment in every relationship when politeness finally gets tired and leaves the room. At first, love feels easy because both people are carefully presenting their best emotional behavior like job candidates trying not to scare each other away. But eventually real personalities arrive. Real fears arrive. Real cultural differences arrive carrying emotional luggage and absolutely no instructions. And for Emily and me, that moment exploded unexpectedly one humid summer night in United States. The strange thing is that the fight started over something incredibly small. Most relationship disasters do. Nobody wakes up thinking, "Today I will emotionally destabilize my entire connection with another human being." Usually it begins with exhaustion, misunderstanding, and one badly timed sentence. That evening, Emily invited me to a small birthday gathering for one of her friends. Normally I had started feeling more comfortable in social situations, but that week had been brutal. Work stress. Lack of sleep. Endless overthinking. My brain felt like 20 browser tabs running simultaneously while emotionally overheating. Still, I went because I wanted to be part of her world. The apartment party was crowded and loud. Music blasted through speakers. People moved between rooms holding drinks and talking at impossible speed. Conversations overlapped so aggressively that my English listening brain nearly filed a formal complaint. At first, I smiled politely and tried keeping up. But after an hour, exhaustion started crushing my concentration. When you speak a second language for long periods, your brain burns energy much faster because it constantly translates, predicts, and processes unfamiliar patterns. Psychologists call this cognitive overload. I call it feeling mentally deep-fried. Emily, meanwhile, looked completely comfortable. She moved easily between conversations, laughing naturally, telling stories, introducing me to people whose names disappeared from my memory approximately 3 seconds later. I tried staying engaged, but slowly I began drifting into silence again. Old survival habits returned automatically. Smile. Nod. Pretend understanding. Avoid embarrassment. At one point, Emily invited me into a conversation with several friends discussing future travel plans. Someone asked whether I wanted to visit New York someday. My exhausted brain froze completely. Before I could answer, Emily laughed lightly and said, "He gets shy in big groups." The sentence itself was harmless. Kind, even. But something inside me reacted immediately. Because suddenly I did not feel shy. I felt small again. Like the insecure version of myself from my first months in America. Everyone smiled politely while the conversation moved forward, but emotionally I had already left the room. The rest of the night became blurry. Music felt louder. My chest felt tighter. And by the time we walked back to Emily's car near midnight, silence had settled heavily between us. Human beings are fascinating creatures. We can survive immigration stress, language barriers, loneliness, and emotional uncertainty, then suddenly collapse because of one sentence said in the wrong tone. Neuroscientists explain this happens because emotional pain activates many of the same neural pathways as physical pain. In simple words, your brain treats social rejection like actual injury. Which honestly explains why awkward conversations can ruin your entire week while stepping on a Lego only ruins your foot. Emily noticed my silence immediately. "You okay?" she asked while unlocking the car. "Yeah," I lied automatically. She looked at me carefully. "No, seriously. What's wrong?" And here is where cultural differences quietly entered the relationship like invisible third-party participants. In my culture, emotional discomfort is often handled indirectly. You stay quiet. You cool down. You avoid confrontation. But Emily believed in immediate communication. Direct communication. American-style emotional transparency. Which sounds healthy in theory until two emotionally exhausted people try doing it after midnight. "Nothing," I repeated. Emily sighed softly. "You've been acting weird all night." That sentence hit harder than it should have. Because deep down, I already worried constantly about being different. Different accent. Different background. Different communication style. Immigrants sometimes carry invisible insecurity into relationships without realizing it. You become hyper-aware of every misunderstanding. Every awkward pause. Every reminder that you did not grow up in the same emotional environment. Suddenly, small comments feel heavier than they are. "I'm not weird," I answered quietly. Emily looked surprised. "I didn't say you were weird. You said I was acting weird." That's not the same thing. Honestly, relationships become terrifying once semantics join the argument. We sat inside the parked car while warm summer air pressed against the windows. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Emily finally said, "Did I embarrass you back there?" The honest answer was yes. But embarrassment was only part of it. The deeper truth was uglier. I was angry because her sentence exposed something I desperately tried hiding from everyone, including myself. Fear. I still felt insecure in groups. I still felt slower than everyone else. My English still collapsed under pressure sometimes. And hearing her casually explain my silence to others made me feel emotionally transparent in the worst way. "I just hate feeling stupid," I admitted quietly. Emily's expression softened immediately. "Hey. I never think you're stupid." "Maybe not," I replied, staring out the window. "But sometimes I feel like I'm always catching up here." Silence filled the car again. Outside, distant traffic lights reflected across the windshield like blurred colors underwater. Emily leaned back into her seat and exhaled slowly. "You know what's frustrating?" she said quietly. "I can never tell what you're feeling until it explodes out all at once." That sentence stung because it was true. Fear had taught me to hide emotions instead of expressing them. Growing up, vulnerability often felt dangerous. Weakness created problems. Silence created safety. But silence inside relationships works like emotional mold. Ignore it long enough, and eventually everything starts smelling strange. Psychologists explain that unresolved emotional tension activates chronic stress responses over time. Your nervous system stays alert even during calm moments because conflict never fully disappears. Basically, suppressed feelings become emotional background noise. "I'm trying," I said quietly. Emily nodded slowly. "I know. But sometimes it feels like you disappear when things get uncomfortable." Ouch. Direct honesty really does hit differently after midnight. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of defending myself again, I started laughing softly. Emily looked confused. "What?" she asked. I shook my head, still laughing tiredly. "It's just funny." "What is?" "I spent 2 years learning English so I could finally communicate better, and now I still don't know how to explain my feelings." Emily stared at me for 1 second before laughing too. Not because the situation was hilarious, but because exhaustion sometimes cracks tension open in strange ways. And weirdly enough, that laughter saved us. Neuroscientists often explain that shared laughter reduces cortisol, the hormone connected to stress and emotional threat. In simpler words, laughing together reminds your nervous systems that you are not enemies. Emily reached over and gently touched my hand. "You know," she said softly, "I don't care if your English isn't perfect." I smiled weakly. "That's good because my English regularly embarrasses both of us." She laughed again. "No. I mean it. I just want you to let me in sometimes instead of pretending everything's fine." That sentence changed something important inside me because I suddenly realized communication is not just about vocabulary. You can know thousands of English words and still struggle emotionally if fear keeps translating your feelings into silence. Relationships do not survive through perfect grammar. They survive through honesty. Through awkward conversations. Through staying present even when misunderstandings happen. We sat there talking quietly for almost another hour. About family expectations. About loneliness. About why both of us struggled with vulnerability in different ways. And somewhere during that long midnight conversation, I realized something uncomfortable but important. Love is not scary because another person might hurt you. Love is scary because eventually they start seeing the parts of you that even you try avoiding. As Emily drove me home through empty summer streets glowing beneath yellow streetlights, I leaned back against the seat feeling emotionally exhausted but strangely lighter too. The fight had not broken us. It had exposed us. And deep down, I think both of us understood that after tonight, whatever existed between us was no longer casual anymore. Fear of marriage. Nobody talks enough about how terrifying love becomes once it starts feeling permanent. Falling in love is exciting in movies because the story usually ends right after the couple kisses dramatically in the rain. Real life is less cinematic. Real life continues after the music fades. Bills appear. Families get involved. Immigration paperwork appears from dark corners like emotional jump scares. And one quiet autumn evening in United States, I realized something that genuinely scared me more than speaking English ever had. I was no longer afraid of losing Emily. I was afraid of becoming responsible for a future with her. That fear arrived slowly. At first, our relationship still felt light and spontaneous. Coffee dates. Late-night conversations. Random road trips. Long walks through grocery stores pretending we only needed one thing before somehow buying snacks and emotional support ice cream. But over time, our lives quietly started merging together. Emily left a toothbrush at my apartment. I learned her coffee order without asking. She memorized which foods reminded me of home. We started saying we without noticing. Human attachment is strange that way. Love rarely arrives like lightning. Most of the time, it builds itself quietly through repeated ordinary moments until one day your life feels incomplete without another person standing inside it. One Sunday afternoon, Emily and I were sitting on the floor of my apartment eating takeout noodles while rain tapped softly against the windows. The heater made its usual suspicious noises like it might explode emotionally at any moment. Emily scrolled absent-mindedly through her phone while I practiced listening to an English podcast quietly in one ear. Then completely casually, without warning, she asked, "Do you ever think about getting married someday?" I nearly choked on noodles immediately. Honestly, my nervous system reacted like she had suddenly asked me to fight a bear with kitchen utensils. The room became silent except for rain and my heartbeat performing unnecessary gymnastics. Emily looked up slowly. "Wow," she laughed nervously. That reaction was aggressive. "No," I said too quickly. "I mean, not aggressive. Just surprising." But the truth was more complicated. Marriage terrified me. Not because I did not care about Emily. That was exactly the problem. I cared too much. Back home, marriage carried enormous emotional weight. It was not just romance. It meant responsibility, stability, family expectations, sacrifice. It meant becoming someone another person could depend on completely. And deep inside, part of me still felt like a confused immigrant pretending adulthood was under control while secretly Googling basic tax questions at midnight. Psychologists often explain that fear of commitment is frequently connected to fear of inadequacy rather than fear of love itself. People are not always afraid to love someone. Sometimes they are afraid they will fail the person they love. That sentence explained me perfectly. Emily sat quietly beside me waiting for an answer. Outside, rain continued sliding slowly down the windows while cars hissed through wet streets below. Finally, I admitted the truth. Sometimes I don't even feel fully stable here yet. Emily frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I struggled to explain because honestly, immigrant fear is difficult to describe unless you have lived it. Even after improving my English, building relationships, and adapting to American life, insecurity still lived quietly inside me. Financial worries, career uncertainty, immigration paperwork, fear of disappointing family back home. Fear that one bad year could collapse everything I worked for. I exhaled slowly. I still feel like I'm building my life from scratch. Emily became quiet for a moment before asking softly, "Do you think you have to become perfect before someone can love you?" That question hit harder than expected because somewhere deep down, yes. I think I believed exactly that. Human beings are experts at creating invisible conditions for their own happiness. I will feel worthy after I succeed more. After I earn more money. After I become more confident. After my English becomes perfect. After I stop being afraid. But life keeps moving while we negotiate with ourselves emotionally. Neuroscientists actually explain that the brain constantly seeks certainty before major decisions because uncertainty activates stress systems connected to survival. In simple words, your brain treats the unknown like danger. Which explains why commitment feels terrifying even when love feels safe. Emily leaned back against the couch and looked at me carefully. "Can I tell you something honest?" she asked quietly. "Sure." "You always talk like stability is a destination," she said softly. "Like one day you'll finally arrive somewhere emotionally perfect. But I don't think anyone feels fully ready for marriage." I stared at her silently because part of me knew she was right. Adults spend enormous energy pretending certainty exists. But most people are improvising their lives while hoping nobody notices. 1 week later, things became even more emotionally complicated. Emily invited me to dinner with her mother. Listen carefully. Meeting someone's parents in America may sound casual in movies, but emotionally it feels like presenting your soul for unofficial inspection. My anxiety returned immediately. Not only because of English. Because family interactions expose cultural differences quickly. Different traditions. Different expectations. Different communication styles. And deep down, I worried Emily's family would eventually realize I was still figuring everything out. The dinner itself started surprisingly well. Emily's mother was warm, funny, and spoke slowly enough for my brain to survive comfortably. We ate roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and pie while talking about work, travel, and family traditions. But then came the dangerous question. "So," her mother smiled casually, "where do you see yourself in 5 years?" Ah, yes. The adult version of emotional dodgeball. My brain immediately panicked because honestly, I barely knew where I saw myself next Tuesday. But before I could answer carefully, Emily looked at me with a small smile and said, hopefully still with me. Everyone laughed warmly. Everyone except my nervous system. Because suddenly the future stopped feeling abstract. It became visible. Real. Terrifyingly possible. That night after dinner, Emily noticed my unusual silence again while we walked toward the car beneath cold autumn air. "You're thinking too hard," she said softly. "I always think too hard." "Yeah," she smiled. "But tonight it looks painful." I laughed weakly because she was not wrong. Fear has a physical weight sometimes. You feel it in your chest. Your shoulders. Your breathing. And as we stood beside her car under yellow streetlights, I finally admitted something out loud I had hidden even from myself. "I'm scared I won't be enough for this kind of life." Emily stared at me quietly for several seconds. Then she stepped closer and touched my hand gently. "Do you know what I think?" she asked softly. "I think you survived moving to another country alone. You rebuilt your life in another language. You learned how to love people here while carrying homesickness every day. Honestly, that sounds stronger than most people I know." Her words hit something deep inside me because immigrants often become so focused on survival that they forget their own resilience. We normalize our struggles until we stop recognizing how difficult they actually were. I looked down at our hands together and realized something uncomfortable but true. My fear of marriage was never really about marriage. It was about vulnerability. About trusting that another person could see my uncertainty and stay anyway. As we drove through quiet American streets glowing beneath autumn lights, my mind kept replaying Emily's question from days earlier. Do you think you have to become perfect before someone can love you? And for the first time, I started wondering if maybe love was never about becoming fearless first. Maybe love was choosing to stay even while fear sat quietly beside you in the car. The day we became parents. There is a moment in life when everything you thought you understood about fear suddenly becomes outdated. Not because fear disappears, but because it changes shape so completely that your old definitions no longer apply. For me, that moment arrived unexpectedly during a quiet early morning in the United States when Emily said something that made time feel like it stopped. Breathing. But to understand why that moment mattered, you need to understand how strangely calm our life had become right before it. After months of emotional storms, awkward conversations, cultural misunderstandings, and deep late-night talks about the future, something subtle had shifted between us. We were no longer just two people figuring things out. We had started building a rhythm together. Morning coffee rituals. Shared grocery lists. Small routines that felt ordinary on the surface but carried emotional weight underneath. Humans often underestimate how powerful routines are in relationships. Psychologists explain that repeated shared experiences create emotional security because the brain associates predictability with safety. In simple terms, love feels stronger when life feels stable enough to repeat itself. Emily and I had reached that stage where silence no longer felt uncomfortable. We could sit in the same room doing different things without needing constant conversation. That might sound small, but for someone who once struggled to order coffee in English without panic, it felt like emotional evolution. One Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight was leaking through the curtains in soft golden lines, and the apartment felt unusually peaceful. Emily was still asleep, wrapped in a blanket on the couch because she had stayed over after we watched a movie the night before. I remember watching her sleep for a moment and thinking something dangerously simple, this feels like home. That thought scared me more than any English mistake ever had. Because once your brain labels someone as home, the emotional stakes change completely. Later that morning, Emily woke up slowly and looked at me with sleepy eyes. Do you want to go somewhere today? She asked casually. Somewhere like where? I replied. She smiled. Just somewhere different. That was how we ended up driving without a fixed destination, something I had slowly learned is very American. In my culture, plans usually have structure. In America, sometimes the plan is simply to not have a plan. We drove for hours through suburban roads, small towns, and stretches of highway that looked like endless film scenes of ordinary life. Gas stations. Fast food signs. Distant mountains fading into sky. During the drive, Emily talked about childhood memories, and I talked about my first months struggling with English in America. Somehow, those stories no longer felt painful. They felt like part of a shared timeline now. Around midday, we stopped at a small park near a quiet lake. The air was fresh, slightly cold, and completely still. Trees reflected perfectly on the water like the world had briefly paused to think. We sat on a wooden bench eating snacks from a small bag Emily had packed. Then she suddenly went quiet. Not the comfortable silence we were used to, but something different. Heavier. I need to tell you something, she said finally. My brain immediately activated panic mode. After everything we had been through, I had learned that sentences starting like that rarely meant something simple. Okay, I said carefully. She looked down at her hands. I took a test this morning. For a second, my mind could not process the words. My first interpretation was completely wrong. My second interpretation was worse. My third interpretation made my heart stop. Emily continued softly, I didn't expect it, but it's positive. The world did not become loud. It became silent. Not peaceful silent. Shock silent. The kind of silence where your brain refuses to translate language anymore because it is too busy trying to survive emotional overload. I remember staring at her without speaking, my English completely useless despite years of practice. Because no amount of listening exercises prepares you for sentences like that. Positive? I repeated slowly, as if confirming the word itself could change reality. She nodded. And then she laughed nervously, almost disbelievingly. Yeah. There are moments when your entire identity reorganizes in real time. That was one of them. I suddenly became aware of everything at once. The lake. The wind. My breathing. The fact that my hands were slightly shaking. Neuroscientists describe this as an acute emotional event where the brain temporarily prioritizes survival processing over language and logic. In simpler terms, my mind basically stopped functioning like a normal human interface. Are you okay? Emily asked gently. That question broke something open inside me. Because the truth was I had no idea what okay even meant in that moment. I wasn't prepared. I wasn't stable enough. I wasn't fluent enough in life for this kind of responsibility. But then I looked at her face again. And I saw something else beneath my panic. Fear, yes. But also uncertainty. And hope. We sat there for a long time without speaking. The lake stayed still. The wind stayed soft. And inside my mind, thousands of thoughts collided at once. Financial fear. Cultural fear. Language fear. Future fear. Every insecurity I had ever carried suddenly appeared like they had been waiting for this exact moment. But underneath all of that noise, something quieter began to emerge. Responsibility does not always arrive when you feel ready. Sometimes it arrives and forces you to grow into it. Emily finally spoke again. I know this is a lot. I nodded slowly. My throat felt tight. Yeah. She looked at me carefully. I wasn't planning this either. That honesty mattered. Because real life rarely respects emotional preparation schedules. People often imagine major life changes happening after perfect timing, stable careers, and complete readiness. But neuroscience suggests humans adapt more through necessity than preparation. The brain learns by responding, not by waiting. Slowly, I reached for her hand. My voice came out quieter than expected. We will figure it out. She looked at me for a long moment, then squeezed my hand gently. And in that simple gesture, something shifted again. Not fear disappearing. Not certainty arriving. But something in between. Commitment without clarity. Love without guarantees. That afternoon, we drove back in silence. Not uncomfortable silence this time. Something more reflective. The kind of silence where your entire life feels like it is quietly rearranging itself behind your thoughts. I kept thinking about everything that had led us here. The coffee shop. The mistakes. The arguments. The slow English conversations that once felt impossible. And now this. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being just someone learning English in America. I had become someone building a life inside it. As we pulled into the driveway that evening, Emily looked at me and said softly, "Are you scared?" I laughed quietly because the answer felt obvious. Completely. She nodded. Me too. And somehow, that was enough. Because fear shared between two people stops feeling like isolation and starts feeling like partnership. That night, I realized something I would never forget. Becoming parents did not start with joy or celebration or perfect readiness. It started with shock, silence, and two people trying to breathe through the same unknown future. And in that uncertainty, love stopped being an idea. It became real. Slow English, slow healing. There are moments in life when time does not feel like it is moving forward normally. It slows down. Not physically, but emotionally. Every sound becomes clearer. Every thought becomes heavier. Every breath feels like it carries meaning. After the day Emily told me we were going to become parents, my entire understanding of life inside United States changed in a way I still struggle to explain even in English. It was not excitement at first. It was not joy. It was something more complicated. A mix of fear, disbelief, responsibility, and a strange quiet hope I did not know how to name. The days after that moment felt like I was walking through the same streets I always knew, but everything looked slightly different. Coffee tasted the same, but I felt different drinking it. Conversations sounded normal, but I heard them differently. Even my slow English listening videos, which had once been just a learning tool, suddenly became something else entirely. They became comfort. Stability. A kind of emotional anchor. I remember sitting alone in the apartment one evening, staring at my phone, replaying a simple slow English story for beginners video for the 5th time. The narrator spoke gently, carefully, as if every word was designed not to overwhelm me. Take your time. You are learning. That sentence hit differently now. Because for the first time, I realized I was not just learning English anymore. I was learning how to stay calm inside uncertainty. Neuroscientists often explain that when humans experience emotional overload, the brain naturally seeks predictable patterns to regain stability. Slow speech, repetitive sounds, and familiar voices help regulate the nervous system by reducing cognitive stress. In simpler terms, slow English was not just helping me understand language. It was helping me understand myself. Emily noticed the change in me too. One night, she sat beside me while I was watching another listening practice video and said, "You look calmer when you listen to that." I laughed softly. It's funny. I started watching this to learn English. Now I watch it to not panic about life. She smiled. Maybe that's the same thing for you now. And she was right in a way I did not fully understand yet. Because language learning had slowly transformed into emotional learning. Every slow sentence taught me patience. Every repeated phrase taught me acceptance. Every simple conversation taught me that I did not need to rush to feel worthy. But life rarely allows calmness to last too long without interruption. A few days later, reality started becoming more practical. Doctor appointments. Insurance questions. Forms I barely understood. American healthcare language is already complicated for native speakers, so for someone still mentally translating English in real time. It felt like decoding a secret system designed by emotionally overqualified accountants. One afternoon, I sat in a waiting room flipping through a stack of papers filled with words like coverage, liability, and estimated cost. My brain felt like it was running a marathon in slow motion. Emily was sitting next to me, calmly filling out forms as if she had been training for this moment her entire life. I looked at her and whispered, "How are you not stressed?" She shrugged. "I am stressed. I just learned how to function while stressed." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else that day. Because I realized something important. Most adults are not calm. They are just experienced at hiding panic while continuing to move forward. Psychologists call this emotional regulation under pressure. It is the ability to continue functioning while your internal state is unstable. In simpler words, adulthood is often just controlled chaos. That realization made me feel slightly less broken. Slowly, I began noticing how deeply interconnected everything in my life had become. My English learning, my relationship with Emily, my fear of the future, my adaptation to American culture, even my understanding of love itself. Everything was blending together into one continuous experience instead of separate categories. One evening, Emily and I went for a walk around our neighborhood. The air was cool. Streetlights reflected softly on the pavement. Houses glowed warmly through windows where other people were living their own invisible lives. Emily suddenly said, "Do you ever think about how different our life was a year ago?" I laughed quietly. A year ago I was afraid to order coffee. She smiled. And now? I looked ahead for a moment before answering. Now I'm afraid of everything, but I still order coffee. She laughed and gently bumped her shoulder against mine. That small gesture carried something powerful. Not dramatic romance. Not cinematic perfection. Just shared reality. The kind of connection that grows through repeated survival of ordinary days. Around this time, I also started paying attention to something I had ignored for a long time. My inner voice. Before, it was loud with criticism. You are too slow. Your English is not good enough. You will embarrass yourself. You will fail. But slowly, through repetition and exposure, that voice began changing. Not disappearing, just softening. Instead of "you cannot do this," it became "you are still learning." Instead of "you are behind," it became "you are progressing slowly." And that shift, as small as it sounds, changed everything. Neuroscience research supports this idea. Internal self-talk directly affects emotional regulation and confidence. The way you speak to yourself literally influences stress levels and decision-making. In other words, your brain listens to your thoughts like instructions. If your thoughts are constantly harsh, your nervous system stays in survival mode. But if your thoughts become supportive, even slightly, your brain begins to calm down. Emily helped with this too without realizing it. She never corrected my English harshly. She never made me feel ashamed for speaking slowly. She simply waited. Listened. Responded. That patience created space for my confidence to grow naturally instead of forcing it. One night, while we were cooking dinner together, I accidentally dropped a plate. It shattered loudly on the kitchen floor. My immediate reaction was stress. Old fear returned instantly. But instead of frustration, Emily just looked at me and said, "Well, that plate had a dramatic exit." I laughed before I even realized I was laughing. That moment might seem small, but it changed something fundamental. Because I realized mistakes do not always need emotional punishment. Sometimes they just need lightness. As weeks passed, I found myself speaking English differently. Not perfectly. Not fluently in a traditional sense. But more comfortably. More naturally. I stopped translating every sentence in my head before speaking. I stopped fearing pauses. I stopped believing silence meant failure. Instead, silence became thinking space. And thinking space became confidence. One afternoon, I went back to the same coffee shop where everything had started. The same counter. The same smell of coffee. The same familiar atmosphere. But I was different now. Emily was not working that day, but the barista still smiled at me. "The usual?" she asked. And for the first time, I did not feel nervous. I smiled and said, "Yes. Small hot coffee, please." No hesitation. No panic. Just language. Just communication. As I waited for my order, I realized something quietly powerful. Healing does not always look like dramatic transformation. Sometimes it looks like slow repetition of ordinary courage. Sometimes it looks like choosing to speak again after fear. Sometimes it looks like staying present even when life feels uncertain. And sometimes it looks like realizing that slow English was never just about learning a language. It was about learning how to live inside your own thoughts without running away from them. That night, as I walked home carrying coffee under soft evening lights, I understood something I wish I had known earlier. You do not become strong by eliminating fear. You become strong by learning how to move forward while fear is still sitting quietly beside you. The question we avoided. There is a strange silence that appears in relationships right before something important is finally said out loud. It is not peaceful silence. It is not comfortable silence. It is the kind of silence that feels like a door slowly closing in a room you are still standing inside. After everything Emily and I had gone through in United States, I started noticing that silence more often. Especially during quiet evenings when life outside looked normal but something inside both of us felt slightly heavier. We had survived misunderstandings, emotional arguments, cultural confusion, fear of commitment, and even the shock of unexpected life changes. On the surface, everything looked stable. We still laughed together. We still cooked together. We still went for walks and shared coffee like usual. But beneath that routine, there was one question neither of us had fully faced again since that night by the lake. What are we actually building together? One evening, Emily and I were sitting on the floor of the apartment eating simple food while a slow English listening video played quietly in the background. The narrator's voice was calm, almost hypnotic, describing everyday life in soft, simple sentences. She walks to the store. She buys fresh bread. She smiles at the cashier. Normally, that kind of English would relax me. But that night, my mind kept drifting somewhere else. Emily was sitting next to me, leaning slightly against the couch, scrolling on her phone but not really focused. I could tell because every few seconds she would pause, stare at nothing, then continue scrolling again. Human behavior always reveals what words try to hide. Psychologists often explain that avoidance is a natural response when emotional topics feel too uncertain or risky. The brain tries to maintain stability by delaying uncomfortable conversations. In simple terms, people avoid questions that might change the emotional structure of their relationship. And for us, There was one question sitting quietly in the room that neither of us had spoken about directly since the pregnancy news changed everything. I turned off the video. The sudden silence felt louder than expected. Emily looked up. "Everything okay?" she asked casually. But I could hear the slight tension underneath her voice. That moment felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible. I nodded slowly. "Yeah. I just think we need to talk." She stopped scrolling immediately. That reaction alone confirmed everything. Some conversations do not need explanation. Their timing says enough. Emily sat up slightly. "Okay." I hesitated because my brain was doing that thing where it tries to protect you from emotional risk by delaying honesty. But delay was becoming impossible now. "What are we doing?" I finally asked. It was a simple question. But simple questions can carry entire futures inside them. Emily did not answer immediately. She looked down at her hands for a long moment. Outside the window, the city lights flickered softly against the night sky. Somewhere in the distance, cars passed, people lived their ordinary lives. Completely unaware that two people inside a small apartment were quietly standing at an emotional crossroads. "I don't know," she finally admitted. That honesty hit harder than any dramatic confession could have. Because uncertainty spoken out loud changes the atmosphere completely. It removes illusion. It removes pretending. It forces reality to sit in the room with you. I leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. "We never really defined anything," I said quietly. "We just kept moving forward." Emily gave a small, tired laugh. "That sounds about right." And it was true. Our relationship had grown organically, emotionally, even beautifully in many ways. But we had avoided labeling it clearly, probably because labeling something makes it feel permanent. And permanence is terrifying when you are still afraid of losing control. Neuroscience research suggests that ambiguity in close relationships activates both attachment and stress systems simultaneously. In other words, uncertainty creates emotional tension because the brain wants clarity but fears the consequences of clarity. That is why undefined relationships often feel both exciting and exhausting at the same time. Emily finally turned toward me fully. "Are you asking if we should decide what we are?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." Silence returned again, but this time it was different. It was not avoidant silence anymore. It was decision silence. The kind of silence where two people are thinking about the same future but from slightly different emotional angles. Emily took a deep breath. "I care about you," she said softly. "More than I expected to." My chest tightened slightly at her words. Because emotional honesty always carries weight, even when it is gentle. "I care about you too," I replied. And I meant it in a way that felt deeper than language. There are moments when English, or any language, becomes insufficient. You are not translating thoughts anymore. You are translating feelings that do not fit neatly into words. Emily looked at me carefully. "But we're also scared," she added. I nodded again. "Yeah." That single word felt like the most honest thing I had said in weeks. Fear had been present in every stage of our journey. Fear of misunderstanding. Fear of commitment. Fear of cultural differences. Fear of becoming responsible for something bigger than ourselves. But fear does not always mean stop. Sometimes fear just means you are standing in front of something important. Emily leaned back slightly and stared at the ceiling. You know what's funny, she said quietly. A year ago, I thought relationships were supposed to feel certain. Like you just know. I smiled faintly. I used to think that too. She turned her head toward me again. And now? I paused before answering. Because the truth had changed over time. Now I think certainty is rare. I think people just decide to stay anyway. That sentence seemed to settle between us like something finally understood without needing further explanation. Emily nodded slowly. That sounds more real. Psychologists often describe commitment not as emotional certainty but as behavioral choice under uncertainty. In simpler terms, people do not commit because they have no fear. They commit because they decide fear is not enough reason to leave. We sat there for a while longer without speaking. The slow English video had ended automatically at some point, leaving only quiet background noise from the city outside. Eventually, Emily spoke again. So what do we do now? That question was not about logistics. It was about direction. I looked at her and realized something I had been avoiding thinking about. Everything we had experienced, moving countries emotionally, building connection through language barriers, surviving misunderstandings. Even facing life-changing news, had already created something that could not simply be ignored or reset. We figure it out together, I said finally. Emily gave a small smile. Not fully relieved. Not fully certain. But present. Okay, she said softly. And somehow that was enough for the moment. Because sometimes relationships do not need perfect answers to continue. They just need two people willing to stay in the question a little longer. That night, after Emily fell asleep, I stayed awake for a while listening to the quiet rhythm of the apartment. My mind replayed everything again from the beginning. The coffee shop. The awkward English mistakes. The arguments. The road trips. The fear. The laughter. The unexpected future forming in slow motion. And I realized something important. We had not solved anything that night. But we had stopped pretending we did not need to. And that alone felt like a turning point neither of us could go back from. The night everything changed. There are nights that look completely normal from the outside but quietly become turning points in a person's entire life story. No dramatic music. No obvious signs. Just ordinary silence, ordinary lights, and two people pretending they are not standing at the edge of something irreversible. After our conversation about uncertainty, Emily and I went through a strange phase inside our life in United States where everything felt both stable and fragile at the same time. We still lived together in the same rhythm. We still laughed. We still shared meals. We still went through daily routines like nothing had changed. But emotionally, something had shifted permanently. It was like walking on ice that looks solid but reminds you constantly that it can crack if you apply too much pressure. And strangely enough, instead of breaking apart, we became quieter with each other in a different way. Not distant. Just more aware. More careful. More present. One night, Emily came home later than usual. I was sitting on the couch watching another slow English listening video, the kind where the narrator speaks gently about simple daily life. He opens the window. He feels the fresh air. He smiles. Those sentences used to feel like language practice. Now they felt like emotional grounding. Emily walked in, dropped her bag by the door, and stood there for a second looking tired in a way I had not seen before. Not physically tired. Emotionally heavy. Long day? I asked. She nodded and sat next to me without speaking for a moment. That silence felt different again. Heavier. Deeper. Eventually she leaned her head back and said softly, I saw a baby today at work. I turned to look at her. Something in her voice changed slightly when she continued. It reminded me of everything. My heart reacted instantly, even before my mind fully understood what she meant. Human emotions often arrive faster than language can translate them. Neuroscientists explain that emotional memory is processed in the limbic system before rational interpretation happens in the prefrontal cortex. In simpler words, you feel first and understand later. How did it make you feel? I asked carefully. Emily paused. Scared, she admitted. Then she laughed softly, almost embarrassed. And not scared at the same time. Which is confusing. I nodded because I understood exactly what she meant. Life-changing responsibilities rarely feel like pure fear or pure excitement. They feel like contradictions existing in the same space. Love and fear sharing the same room without agreeing on anything. I turned off the video playing in the background again. The apartment became quiet immediately. Emily looked at me. Do you ever think we're actually ready for this? She asked quietly. That question hit differently than before. Because it was no longer abstract. It was no longer about future possibilities. It was about reality we were already living inside. I took a slow breath before answering. I don't think anyone feels ready, I said honestly. Emily gave a small, tired smile. That's not very comforting. I laughed softly. I know. But it might be true. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Sometimes I feel like we're just two people trying to learn adulthood in real time. That sentence stayed in the air longer than expected because it was accurate in a way that felt slightly uncomfortable. Many adults silently feel like they are improvising their lives while pretending everything is under control. Psychologists call this phenomenon imposter adulthood, where individuals feel unprepared for responsibilities even while successfully managing them. I looked at Emily and said, we are learning. That's all we can do. She nodded slowly, then added something unexpected. I don't want to do this alone. My chest tightened because even though she did not say it directly, I knew what she meant. This was no longer just about relationship uncertainty. This was about shared responsibility. Shared fear. Shared future. And shared vulnerability. I reached for her hand gently. You're not alone, I said. Emily looked at me for a long moment. Not searching for certainty this time. Just presence. Just honesty. Then she whispered, okay. That single word carried more emotional weight than any long explanation could have. The days that followed felt strangely different. Not easier. Not harder. Just more real. We started talking more openly about practical things. Finances. Living arrangements. Plans. Doctor visits. Things that once felt distant now became part of everyday conversation. At times, it felt overwhelming. At other times, it felt strangely grounding, like finally naming something that had been floating in uncertainty for too long. One evening, we went for a walk around the neighborhood after dinner. The air was cool, and the sky was deep blue fading into night. Streetlights reflected softly on the pavement, and distant voices of other families filled the quiet background of suburban life. Emily suddenly said, "Do you think your family will be okay with everything?" That question brought a new layer of complexity into the conversation. Because immigration is never just about geography. It is about identity, expectation, and emotional distance between worlds. I thought carefully before answering. "They will be surprised," I said. "But they will care. That's the most important part." Emily nodded slowly. "My mom is going to cry," she said half joking. I smiled. That sounds very American emotional support system. She laughed and bumped her shoulder lightly against mine. That small moment of humor mattered more than it seemed. Because humor often appears when tension becomes too heavy to carry silently. Neuroscience research shows that shared laughter releases endorphins that reduce emotional stress and strengthen social bonding. In simple terms, laughing together is the nervous system's way of saying we are still okay. As we walked, I realized something quietly important. Our relationship had entered a phase where love was no longer just emotional. It had become structural. Like building something that now required planning, maintenance, and responsibility. Not less romantic. Just more real. Later that night, when we returned home, Emily stood by the window for a long time looking outside. "I keep thinking about how everything changed so fast," she said softly. I stood beside her. "It didn't feel fast while it was happening," I replied. She nodded. "Yeah. It only feels fast when you look back." That sentence stayed with me because it explained something fundamental about human experience. Change rarely feels sudden while you are inside it. It only feels sudden when you realize you are no longer the same person who started. Emily turned toward me and asked quietly, "Are you scared right now?" I thought for a moment before answering honestly. "Yes." She nodded. "Me too." And then something unexpected happened. Instead of trying to fix the fear or escape it, we just stood there together inside it. No solutions. No guarantees. Just shared presence. And in that moment, I realized something I had never fully understood before. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing not to face fear alone. That night did not solve our future. It did not remove uncertainty. It did not create perfect clarity. But it changed something deeper. It made us stop pretending that uncertainty was something we had to carry separately. And somehow, that made everything feel slightly more possible than before. From fear to courage in love. There is a strange kind of quiet that arrives after everything has already changed. It is not the silence of confusion anymore. It is not the silence of fear. It is the silence of acceptance, the kind that settles into your life like it has always belonged there, even if you did not recognize it at first. After all the uncertainty, arguments, late-night conversations, and emotional storms, Emily and I finally reached a place in our life in the United States where nothing felt simple, but everything felt real. Our lives did not suddenly become perfect. In fact, they became more complicated in many ways. But complexity no longer scared me the same way it used to. Because somewhere along the journey, fear had stopped being the enemy and started becoming something I could walk with instead of run from. The apartment we lived in had become quieter lately, not because anything was missing, but because we had learned how to exist without constantly filling every silence with words. Emily would sit on the couch reading or scrolling quietly, and I would sometimes watch slow English listening videos, not for practice anymore, but for grounding. The narrator's calm voice had become something familiar in my life, almost like a reminder that clarity can exist even in simple sentences. He breathes. He feels. He continues. Those kinds of phrases no longer felt like language lessons. They felt like life instructions. One evening, Emily sat beside me holding a warm cup of tea. Her hand rested gently on her stomach for a moment, and she smiled softly without saying anything at first. I noticed the gesture immediately, but I waited. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because I had learned that some moments deserve silence before interpretation. Finally, she looked at me and said quietly, "I think I understand something now." My heart slowed slightly, not out of panic this time, but awareness. "What do you mean?" I asked. She took a breath. "I used to think love was supposed to feel certain. Like a straight path. But now I think it's more like learning how to stay steady inside uncertainty." I smiled because I realized she had arrived at the same understanding I had been slowly building for months. Neuroscientists often explain that the human brain craves certainty because uncertainty activates survival responses. But long-term emotional stability does not come from eliminating uncertainty. It comes from learning to function within it without shutting down emotionally. In simpler words, peace is not the absence of unknowns. It is the ability to move forward anyway. I looked at Emily and said softly, "We never needed perfect certainty. We just needed to stop running from the unknown." She nodded slowly. And we stopped running. That sentence felt important because it described the transformation neither of us noticed happening in real time. Fear had not disappeared. It had simply lost control over our decisions. Over time, we had learned how to communicate better. Not perfectly, but honestly. I still made mistakes in English sometimes, but those mistakes no longer carried shame. Emily still misunderstood me occasionally, but misunderstandings no longer felt like threats. They became conversations instead of crises. One night, we went back to the coffee shop where everything had started. The same counter. The same smell of roasted beans. The same soft hum of conversations between strangers living their separate lives. The barista recognized us immediately and smiled. "The usual?" she asked. I looked at Emily and smiled. "Yes. 2 small coffees." As I said it, I realized something quietly powerful. That sentence once represented fear. Now it represented routine. Growth is often invisible while it is happening. You only recognize it when something that once terrified you becomes ordinary. We sat near the window like we used to in the early days, watching people pass outside under evening lights. Emily leaned her head slightly against my shoulder and said, "Do you remember when you couldn't even order here without panicking?" I laughed softly. I remember thinking this place was emotionally dangerous. She laughed. "It still is. Just in a different way." We both understood what she meant. Life does not stop being intense. It just changes where intensity lives. Earlier fears were about language, culture, and survival. Now fears were about responsibility, future, and emotional depth. But we were no longer avoiding those fears. We were sharing them. Psychologists describe this stage of relationships as secure interdependence, where two people maintain individuality while also relying on each other emotionally. In simple terms, it is not dependence or independence. It is connection with awareness. After coffee, we walked outside slowly. The air was cool, and the city lights reflected softly on the pavement. Everything felt ordinary, but ordinariness itself felt meaningful now. Emily suddenly said, "If someone told me a year ago that my life would look like this, I wouldn't have believed them." I nodded. "Same." She smiled. "And are you happy?" That question used to scare me because I used to think happiness had to be absolute. But now I understood it differently. I thought carefully before answering. "I think I am not finished," I said slowly. "But I am not running anymore." Emily smiled quietly. That sounds like enough. And maybe it was. Because happiness is not a permanent state. It is a direction you keep choosing, even when uncertainty still exists. We stood there for a while longer, not needing to say anything else. There was something peaceful about not trying to solve the future in a single conversation anymore. As we walked home together, I realized something I had never been able to understand in textbooks or language lessons. Learning English had been the surface journey. Learning fear had been the deeper one. But learning love had been the most complex of all. Because love was never just about understanding another person. It was about learning how to remain open even when life does not offer guarantees. When we finally reached home, Emily turned to me at the door and smiled softly. "We made it through a lot, huh?" I smiled back. "We are still making it." She nodded. "Yeah. And I think that's the point." That night, after she fell asleep, I stayed awake for a while listening to the quiet sounds of the apartment. And for the first time in a long time, my thoughts were not filled with panic or uncertainty. They were filled with something simpler. Gratitude. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had stopped measuring life by perfection at all. I had started measuring it by presence, by honesty, by shared moments that once felt impossible but now felt natural. And as I looked back at everything, from fear, to mistakes, to slow English conversations, to unexpected love, I finally understood the truth behind it all. From fear to courage is not a single moment. It is 1,000 small decisions to stay, speak, try again, and love even when certainty never fully arrives. And somehow, in that imperfect, unfinished journey, life had quietly become something beautiful. And maybe that's the part nobody tells you about love, about life. About learning a language in a country that doesn't sound like your first home anymore. You don't suddenly become fearless. You don't suddenly become fluent. You don't suddenly become ready for everything that's coming next. You just keep showing up on the days when your mind is loud, when your English feels slow, when your heart is unsure. And when the future refuses to explain itself. Because courage was never the absence of fear, it was learning how to breathe inside it without running away. And if you're listening to this right now while trying to improve your English, while feeling stuck, or while wondering if you're too late to change your life, I want you to remember something I learned the hard way in United States. Progress doesn't sound impressive when it's happening. It sounds like mistakes. It sounds like pauses. It sounds like silence where your brain is still translating life one word at a time. But one day, without warning, you realize something strange. The things that once terrified you have become part of your normal life. And that's when you understand you were never standing still, you were quietly transforming. So let me ask you one last question before you leave this story behind. What version of you are you afraid to become, simply because you haven't met them yet? And if this story stayed with you even a little, don't let it disappear into silence. Subscribe to this channel, because next time, we're going even deeper into stories that help you think in English, feel in English, and slowly live in English without fear. And maybe, the next story will sound a lot like your own life before you even realize it.